Operations Log. Incident Iceberg Unit Commander. Captain Hargrove Unit. U.S. Coast Guard Mobile Rapid Response Team. MRRT. Alaska Sector Operation Start Date. Date Missing Location. Uncharted Fjord. Approximate Coordinates. Alaskan Coast. 6:30 a.m. local time. The gray, unwelcoming Alaskan sky hung low over the icy water, mirroring its surface in dull, leaden tones. At the Juneau Rescue Coordination Center, the typical morning bustle was underway. Shift reports, equipment checks, low conversations. But this routine was shattered by a signal that clawed its way through the static crackle of the airwaves. An SOS. The source, the research vessel, Polar Star. Officially, the vessel was engaged in routine work. Seismic monitoring, ecological data collection within a strictly defined quadrant of water. But the signal was distorted, intermittent, as if the transmitter itself were in its death throes. And immediately following that brief, desperate burst, silence. All attempts by the center to re-establish contact with the Polar Star met with dead air. No response, not even a faint carrier signal. The vessel had simply vanished from the airwaves. The Automated Identification System, AIS, added unsettling details. The vessel's last recorded position was bizarre, raising immediate red flags. The Polar Star wasn't in its designated research sector, but deep within a narrow fjord, barely marked on the charts. This place, hemmed in by sheer cliffs draped in perpetual snow and ice, was utterly unsuitable for the planned seismic work. Moreover, navigating such confined waters was extremely risky, almost suicidal, for a vessel of the Polar Star's class. What had compelled the captain to deviate from the route and steer the vessel into this ice-choked trap? There were no answers. The decision was immediate. The order to deploy the Mobile Rapid Response Team reached Captain Hargrove almost simultaneously with the incident report. His unit, bearing the unofficial call sign Fjord Sentinels, comprised 12 hardened professionals accustomed to Alaska's harsh conditions. The team included a medic and a specialist in communications and electronic warfare, EW, ready for any contingency. The mobilization was swift, executed with practiced precision. Standard gear for maritime interdiction and shore operations in Arctic conditions was checked and loaded. Layered thermal underwear beneath waterproof membrane suits. M4 carbines equipped with optics and weapon-mounted lights. Reliable Mossberg 590 shotguns for close-quarters combat. Sig Sauer P, 229 sidearms in thigh holsters. Thermal imagers and night vision devices, NVGs, were standard issue, as were individual first aid kits, IFAKs, carried by each operator. A concise briefing took place aboard a Sentinel-class cutter, already underway at full speed toward the incident area. Hargrove laid out the known facts: SOS, lost comms, anomalous position. The hypotheses were few, but each carried potential menace. First, a navigational accident, steering failure, collision with a submerged rock or a hidden iceberg. Second, hostile takeover. Piracy in these latitudes seemed improbable, almost fantastical, but couldn't be entirely ruled out. Third, an onboard emergency of unknown nature. Fire, hazardous material leak, mutiny. Hargrove specifically mentioned the strange deviation from course and the unnerving silence following the distress call. It suggested the possibility of undisclosed, covert research being conducted aboard the Polar Star, something not listed in the official manifests. Something that could have gone catastrophically wrong. Reaching the fjord's entrance, the Sentinel reduced speed. A rigid hull inflatable boat, RIB, was launched from its deck. Hargrove's main team transferred to the smaller craft. The cutter itself remained on station at the fjord's mouth, ready to provide communication support and, if necessary, fire support from its deck guns, as range and terrain permitted. Weather conditions were deteriorating. Low, heavy clouds nearly touched the cliff tops, limiting visibility. The air temperature hovered around freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. There was a slight swell at the fjord's entrance, but deeper within the narrow throat between the cliffs, the wind picked up, kicking up fine spray from the leaden water. The RHIB sped onward, cutting through the waves, leaving a white wake churning behind it. 8:45 a.m. Through the veil of drizzling snow and fog, a silhouette emerged. The Polar Star. The ship hadn't sunk. She sat hard aground at the base of the rocky shore, listing heavily to port. From this distance, there were no visible hull breaches or severe damage typical of a collision. But something felt wrong. The deck looked untidy, even from afar, strewn with equipment, torn canvas covers flapping loose. There were no signs of life, no movement on board, no lights in the portholes. The lack of smoke from the funnel indicated the engines and generators were dead. The ship seemed dead in the water. Hargrove issued the order over the internal comms. The team went to condition red. Safety catches clicked off weapons. Operators checked the security of their gear, adjusted comms headsets. Each scanned their assigned sector of observation and fire as they approached the motionless vessel. Grant, the medic, double-checked the contents of his trauma pack one last time. Tension hung heavy in the air, thick and cold as the Arctic fog itself. It was clear to everyone. This wasn't a standard rescue operation. The situation felt wrong, unsettling, outside the parameters of familiar incidents. Something terrible had happened aboard the Polar Star. The RIB carefully approached the listing port side of the Polar Star. Waves lapped quietly against the steel hull, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. 8 operators from the assault team, moving with practiced silence and coordination, boarded the research vessel. 2 remained on the RIB, their rifles covering the deck and the surrounding cliffs, providing overwatch. 2 more, including the comms EW specialist, stayed with Captain Hargrove a short distance from the vessel, coordinating the team's actions and maintaining the comms link with the cutter at the fjord mouth. Hargrove watched every move through binoculars, ready to join the main group at the first signal. The first thing that struck them on deck was the disorder, but not the kind left by a heavy storm. This was a different kind of chaos. The deck was awash in seawater mixed with something dark, viscous, that left sticky footprints on their boots. The air hung heavy with the stench of salt, engine oil, and the faint but distinct metallic tang of blood. Scientific gear winches, sample containers, sensors, was scattered haphazardly. Some instruments clearly damaged, their mountings torn or cut clean through. A palpable sense of abandonment and sudden catastrophe permeated the cold air. Closer inspection confirmed their worst fears in the most graphic way possible. Evidence of a struggle was everywhere. Dark spatters stained the wheelhouse bulkheads. Small, congealed pools lay on the steel deck plates. It was blood. In some places, a lot of it. Near one of the overturned containers, the operators found several spent shell casings. A quick inspection showed a caliber inconsistent with standard U.S. Coast Guard or other U.S. agency issue firearms. Something else entirely. On the bridge, more signs of violence were discovered. Communication equipment, radios, satellite terminal was smashed, screens cracked, wires ripped out. Someone had clearly intended to cut the vessel off from the outside world. All evidence pointed to a fierce firefight or a sudden violent assault. But the strangest and most disturbing discovery awaited the operators not just on deck. On sections clear of water and debris, and also on the adjacent rocky shore where the ship's hull nearly touched land, they found tracks. Huge tracks, pressed deep into the frozen ground and patches of snow. They resembled the paw prints of a large predator, maybe a wolf, but their size was unnatural, far exceeding the dimensions of any known local Arctic fauna. Between the rocks on the shore and snagged on torn pieces of canvas on deck, the operators found clumps of thick, coarse gray fur. Fur belonging to no known animal native to the Alaskan coast. A methodical sweep of the interior began. The team moved cautiously, sector by sector, deck by deck. Bridge, crew quarters, galley, science labs, engine room. The picture repeated itself. Doors torn from hinges or smashed open, overturned furniture, wrecked equipment. The labs were scenes of utter devastation. Shards of glass from flasks and beakers crunched underfoot. Expensive centrifuges and analyzers were mangled as if struck repeatedly by something heavy. Trails of blood led from corridors into cabins and labs, disappearing and reappearing. But not a single body, neither dead nor injured, was found. This was the most inexplicable part. Where had the crew gone? In one of the least damaged labs, a terminal running on emergency power was discovered. The screen was smashed, but some data on the hard drive seemed to have survived. The comms specialist quickly connected his ruggedized tablet, attempting to salvage any information. Amidst a multitude of corrupted files, they managed to recover fragments of work logs. Troubling entries flickered across the screen. Mentions of instability of obtained samples, reports on aggressive reactions in test subjects, references to emergency containment protocols. Nearby lay folders containing official documentation for the seismic monitoring mission, all looking neat and untouched. But it was now glaringly obvious these papers served merely as a cover for entirely different dangerous activities. Captain Hargrove, receiving the report from the team aboard the vessel, pieced together the scattered facts. His initial assessment was grim. Aboard the Polar Star, under the guise of scientific research, risky, possibly biological experiments had been conducted. Something went horribly wrong. Either there was a leak of hazardous material or an uprising of the creatures being experimented upon. The complete absence of crew members was the biggest worry. Perhaps not all had died on board. Perhaps some had tried to escape, making it to shore. The decision was made quickly. The huge tracks leading from the deck onto the shore left no doubt. They led inland, deeper into the fjord, towards a structure faintly visible in the distance through the fog. An old, clearly abandoned building on the coast. It was imperative to determine the crew's fate and understand the nature of the threat they faced. Hargrove ordered 2 operators to remain behind, guarding the vessel and the potential extraction point. The main group, now 10 strong, including the captain himself, would follow the tracks to find any survivors and definitively clarify the circumstances of the disaster aboard the Polar Star. The tension didn't subside. On the contrary, it intensified with each new discovery. 10 figures in Arctic camouflage moved deeper into the fjord, leaving the silent, listing hull of the Polar Star behind them. Movement along the shore required caution and endurance. Underfoot was a treacherous mix of sharp, sea-smoothed rocks, slippery ice-coated boulders, and patches of frozen tundra vegetation that snagged at their legs. The team moved in standard tactical formation, 2 operators on point, carefully scanning the terrain ahead, the main element led by Captain Hargrove and Grant the medic, and 2 operators bringing up the rear, covering their back trail. The enormous, inhuman tracks were clearly visible on the damp sand near the water's edge, and in the patches of snow between the rocks. They were distinct, deep, testifying to the significant weight and power of the creatures that made them. The tracks led relentlessly toward the darkening silhouette of the abandoned structure ahead. As they drew closer, details of the structure became clearer. It was an old, long-abandoned whaling station. Rusted skeletons of lifting cranes reached like skeletal fingers towards the low gray sky. Dilapidated wooden and metal buildings with shattered windows and collapsed roofs stood like black smudges against the cliffs. Huge corroded tanks, once used for storing whale oil, stood askew like drunken giants. The entire place radiated an aura of desolation and hidden menace. The wind, whistling through the rusted structures, moaned and groaned, creating an eerie, nerve-wracking symphony of decay. It felt as if the station itself were a living entity, lying in wait, holding its breath. The fresh tracks of the unknown creatures didn't meander. They led straight to the main, best-preserved building of the station, a long, low structure that likely once served as living quarters or an administration block. Right by the entrance, half buried in snow, lay a shredded backpack. Nearby, a smashed handheld radio lay on the ground. Judging by the appearance and type of gear, it belonged to someone from the Polar Star's crew. Their attempt to reach shelter had been their last. The operators took up positions flanking the entrance. Hargrove gave the command. 2 operators breached the dilapidated door with swift kicks, and the group moved cautiously inside. The first thing that hit them was the heavy, stale air. The smell of years of rust, rotting wood, and mold mingled with something else. A sickly, sweet, metallic, nauseating stench of dried blood, much stronger and more concentrated than on the ship's deck. Semi-darkness reigned within. Light filtered only through a few grimy or boarded-up windows and gaping holes in the walls. Debris crunched underfoot, fragments of furniture, fallen plaster, shattered glass. Moving down a dark corridor, the team emerged into a large room, judging by the remnants of furniture. Long tables and benches, overturned and broken. It had been the station's former mess hall or common room. And there they saw it. Something that froze even the hardened operators in place. Scattered across the floor in different corners of the room lay bodies. Several bodies, belonging to members of the Polar Star's crew, judging by the tattered remains of their clothing. But recognizing anyone was impossible. The bodies had been mutilated with inhuman savagery, torn apart with incredible, monstrous force. The scene was horrific, surpassing anything the operators had encountered in their years of service. Medic Grant, overcoming his initial shock, knelt beside the nearest remains. His face was impassive, but his voice was tight when he quietly reported to Hargrove. Death was caused by multiple massive tearing wounds, inflicted undoubtedly by the claws and teeth of a massive predator. The nature of the injuries spoke of an almost unimaginable level of aggression from the attackers. Analysis of the scene left no doubt. What they faced were not just wild animals crazed by hunger. These creatures killed with a specific, sadistic brutality, as if reveling in the very act of destruction. And they had clearly established this territory as their own, turning the abandoned station into their lair. Hargrove ordered the team to maximum combat readiness. Every rustle, every flicker of movement in the shadows was now perceived as a potential threat. Before moving deeper, they needed to check communications. The specialist tried again to raise the cutter. The signal was extremely weak, constantly breaking up. The massive metal structures of the station and the surrounding cliffs were causing severe interference. Reporting the situation and requesting backup was impossible. They would have to rely solely on their own resources. The operators checked and reloaded their weapons, confirmed the function of their weapon-mounted lights. Thermals and NVGs were activated, although in the semi-darkness of the interior they provided a distorted picture, full of thermal anomalies from rusted metal and the remnants of long-dead equipment. The decision was clear: continue clearing the station, sector by sector. They had to find the source of the threat, or, if they were lucky, any other surviving crew members. The team advanced deeper into the first building of the whaling station, slowly and methodically. Each footstep echoed unnervingly in the empty corridors. The operators moved according to close-quarters combat, CQC protocols. The point man moved ahead, covered by the others. Doors encountered were either carefully eased open or breached with a single sharp kick, the room beyond instantly secured. Corners and dark alcoves were checked using small tactical mirrors on telescopic poles or with quick practiced peeks from behind cover. The oppressive silence, broken only by the screech of rusted metal in the wind outside and their own footfalls, pressed on the nerves more intensely than open combat. The anticipation of attack was almost physically palpable. The ambush awaited them in a long, dark corridor that apparently led from the administrative section into the station's processing workshops. The corridor was cluttered with some kind of industrial debris, creating perfect cover. The attack was lightning fast, chaotic, and utterly unexpected. From side openings, hidden in the shadows of doorless doorways, and even from somewhere above, amidst the rusted beams near the ceiling, dark, indistinct figures descended upon the team. It all happened in a fraction of a second. The air filled with animalistic snarls, the shriek of metal being torn by claws, the short cries of operators caught off guard, and the deafening roar of return fire. In the ensuing chaos, one of the point men, Private Miller, was thrown aside by a blow of monstrous force. He slammed into the wall, his short, cut-off cry lost in the din of battle. The operators opened fire, but their targets were nearly invisible in the darkness, mere flitting shadows moving with incredible speed. Fire was more instinctive, directed towards the threat, rather than carefully aimed. Short bursts from the M4S tore through the gloom with muzzle flashes, momentarily illuminating nightmarish silhouettes. It was in those brief moments, illuminated by the tactical lights mounted on their weapons and the muzzle flashes, that the operators got a proper glimpse of their attackers. They were not wolves, not bears, nor any known terrestrial creature. The figures were humanoid, moving on two legs, but their proportions were distorted. They possessed elongated wolf-like muzzles filled with rows of sharp teeth and powerful limbs ending in long black claws capable of rending metal. Their bodies were covered in the same thick, coarse gray fur, clumps of which they had found back on the shore. Their movements were incredibly fast, bestial, jerky, yet there was something calculated in their actions, in the way they attacked cohesively, using cover and darkness, something not characteristic of mere predators. The fight was short but fierce. Having met determined resistance and possibly sustaining casualties from the heavy volume of fire, the attackers vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. They melted back into the darkness of the processing workshops, retreating into the labyrinth of rusted structures. Judging by the sounds, they dragged their wounded or dead brethren with them. They didn't charge blindly into gunfire. They preferred to withdraw when faced with organized opposition. As soon as the firing stopped, Hargrove ordered a status check. Private Miller was found where he'd been thrown. He was dead. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, broken. Deep claw gouges tore through the outer layer of his body armor. Grant, after a quick examination, just shook his head and confirmed KIA. It became chillingly clear their opponents weren't just mutated animals. This was an organized pack of intelligent and deadly creatures, utilizing ambush tactics and possessing intimate knowledge of the abandoned station's maze-like layout. The team quickly fell back along the corridor into one of the previously cleared larger, more defensible rooms. They needed to regroup and assess the situation. The doors were blocked and operators took up positions at windows and breaches, establishing a temporary defensive perimeter. A quick ammo check confirmed what they feared. Supplies were significantly depleted after the brief firefight. Several operators had sustained minor injuries. Bruises from falls, scratches from claws that had glanced off gear. Grant quickly treated the wounds. Another attempt to contact the cutter failed. Only static crackled in their headsets. The mood within the team was grim. The adrenaline from the fight mingled with a cold premonition of further dangers, anger over the loss they had suffered, and a growing, irrational fear of this unknown enemy. In the relative safety of the fortified room, Captain Hargrove conducted a quick debrief with his men. They spoke quietly, exchanging observations. Everyone noted the clear coordination in the creature's actions, their astonishing ability to move quickly and silently through the darkness, utilizing every bit of cover and the station's complex architecture. They had attacked from multiple directions, clearly attempting to divide and disorient the team. This led to the obvious conclusion. The pack must have a leader, an alpha, directing their actions. The hypothesis of intelligent leadership among these beasts was becoming increasingly likely. The team remained in cover, tensely awaiting further developments. A new attack could come at any moment. Operators rotated watch, scanning the approaches to the room through the remaining windows and breaches using thermal imagers. The devices showed chaotic heat signatures moving in other parts of the station, signs of movement. In the ensuing quiet, distant sounds were audible. Heavy footsteps on metal grating somewhere deep within the workshops, the scrape of claws on concrete or rust. The enemy was close. They hadn't left. They were waiting, or perhaps preparing for another assault. The second attack wasn't long in coming, but it was different, more organized, more calculated. The creatures didn't launch a suicidal frontal assault. Instead, they attempted to breach the team's defenses simultaneously from multiple directions. A loud banging erupted from the blocked main door. They were trying to break it down from the outside. Simultaneously, the sound of scraping and clanging metal came from above. Several creatures were attempting to infiltrate through ventilation shafts, tearing the grates away. Another group attacked through a breach in the wall, using it like an embrasure for quick, darting attacks. It was during this fight, in the beams of tactical lights slicing through the darkness outside the wall breach, that the operator saw him. The figure that appeared in the opening was noticeably larger and more massive than the other wolf humanoids, taller with broader shoulders. He didn't charge into the fray with the others. He stood motionless for a moment, observing the fight, his silhouette stark against the backdrop of ruins. A low, vibrating growl emanated from his chest, unlike the furious yelps of the other creatures. It sounded more like commands or signals. In the beams of the flashlights, his eyes momentarily flashed with a bright yellow light. It was him, the Alpha, the pack leader. His tactical cunning became obvious almost immediately. When the Coast Guardsmen concentrated their fire on one direction, trying to suppress the attackers at the door, the Alpha let out a short, guttural snarl. The attackers instantly pulled back from the door, as if on command. In the same second, another group of creatures intensified their assault through the breach in the wall, attempting to exploit the defenders' shift in focus. The Alpha was clearly assessing the level of threat from each direction and redistributing his pack's forces, trying to minimize their losses while probing for a weak spot in the team's defense. Despite the enemy's tactical maneuvers, the coordinated actions and heavy volume of fire from Hargrove's team held them off. They managed to repel this more organized attack as well. Several attackers were wounded or killed. Their bodies were instantly dragged away into the darkness by their comrades, leaving no trophies behind. This time, the team suffered no losses, but their ammunition supply continued to dwindle at an alarming rate. The hypothesis of a leader was now irrefutably confirmed. It became starkly apparent that the team was facing not just a pack of feral mutants, but an organized group under the command of an intelligent, or at least possessing advanced tactical thinking, leader, the Alpha. This Alpha held complete control over his kin and prevented them from suffering unnecessary losses in senseless attacks. This knowledge fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. This was no longer just a monster hunt. This was a confrontation with an organized, cunning, and deadly opponent capable of thinking and adapting. And this opponent was on its home turf. Captain Hargrove understood. Remaining in passive defense was a path to inevitable defeat. Ammunition and stamina were finite, while the enemy, familiar with the terrain and led by an intelligent leader, could wear down and destroy the team piece by piece. They needed to change tactics, seize the initiative. The best defense in this situation was a good offense. The objective was clear. Hunt down and eliminate the Alpha. His death, Hargrove reasoned, would likely disorganize the pack, strip it of coordination, and break its morale. A plan began to form rapidly in Hargrove's mind, based on the available intelligence and the features of the station. They needed to force the enemy into a fight on terms advantageous to the team. The ideal location for this seemed to be the central, largest building of the station, the former Whale Flensing Hall. Judging by its external dimensions, it was a vast, almost hangar-like space. Such an area would offer an advantage in firepower, allowing effective use of tactical lights and flashbang grenades. The multitude of rusted machinery, enormous vats, winches, and metal structures within the hall could serve as cover for the operators, enabling interlocking fields of fire. The plan received the tentative designation, the Corral. The team split into two groups. The first group, callsign Hammer, consisted of 6 operators. Their task was to begin an active, noisy advance through the corridors and rooms adjacent to the Flensing Hall. They were to simulate a main assault, apply pressure on the enemy using suppressive fire and flashbangs, and purposefully flush the pack towards the main hall. The second group, Anvil, comprising 4 operators under Hargrove's direct command, would move covertly. Their mission was to bypass the main engagement zone and occupy predetermined firing positions covering the primary entrances and passages leading into the Flensing Hall. They were to meet the pack, retreating under pressure from Hammer, with concentrated fire, and prevent their escape from the trap. The operation commenced. Hammer Group moved out, their heavy footsteps and short, barked commands echoing through the ruins. Soon the sounds of a firefight erupted. The creatures, as expected, offered fierce resistance. They employed their favored tactics: sudden attacks from darkness, ambushes around corners, utilizing the upper levels of the structures for movement. Hammer Team responded with dense fire, making liberal use of M84 flashbang grenades, whose blinding flashes and deafening reports disoriented the enemy in the confined spaces, forcing them to fall back. The Alpha, judging by the changing nature of the resistance, quickly grasped Hargrove's maneuver. He attempted to lead his pack out of the forming encirclement, guiding them towards side corridors and passages. But the escape routes were either already cut off by Anvil Group or covered by fire from their pre-established positions. Several creatures that attempted to break through flanking routes were met with accurate fire and driven back. The pack leader found himself facing a choice: either continue taking losses in the narrow corridors under Hammer's relentless fire, or retreat into the only available space, the huge Flensing Hall. He chose the latter. Snarls and the sounds of the pack's hasty retreat reached the operators of both groups. Hammer Group, maintaining pressure, entered the vast hall on the heels of the retreating enemy. Almost simultaneously, Anvil Group definitively sealed the main exits, taking up positions on catwalks and behind massive pieces of equipment. The pack and its leader were trapped inside the gigantic, dimly lit space filled with the rusted remnants of the whaling industry. The trap had sprung. The operators quickly established advantageous firing points. Some went prone on precarious metal catwalks and galleries near the ceiling. Others took cover behind enormous rust-covered flensing tables and winches on the floor below. Powerful tactical lights mounted on weapons and helmets pierced the gloom, picking out support columns, dangling chains, and the sinister silhouettes of old machinery. The operators checked their magazines, chambered rounds. The air crackled with tension. The final showdown was inevitable. The hunt had entered its decisive phase. The vast Flensing Hall transformed into an arena of ferocious combat. The deep gloom under the high vaulted ceiling became the creature's ally. They used it with astonishing effectiveness, hiding behind giant rusted vats once used for rendering blubber, behind the massive frames of cutting machinery, behind the pillars supporting the upper galleries. Their attacks were swift and unexpected. They would burst from the darkness for a fleeting moment, strike with claws or attempt to knock an operator off balance, and then immediately melt back into the shadows. The Alpha didn't directly participate in every skirmish. He kept slightly back, moving between cover, his low, commanding snarls directing the pack's assaults towards groups of operators that seemed most vulnerable or isolated. But Hargrove's team was prepared for such tactics. The operators worked cohesively, covering each other. Commands were given briefly over the radio net. Flashbangs were employed again, their blinding flashes and deafening roars momentarily ripping the hiding creatures from the darkness, making them vulnerable to aimed fire. Red streaks of tracer rounds, used for target designation, crisscrossed the semi-darkness of the hall. One operator would spot a target, another would open accurate fire. Shots were fired in short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition and maximizing accuracy. Interlocking fields of fire from different levels, the floor and the upper galleries, created a dense screen of lead, preventing the creatures from closing in with impunity. Despite their bestial strength, agility, and knowledge of the terrain, the creatures couldn't withstand the organized onslaught of automatic weapons fire for long. The advantage in firepower clearly lay with the humans. Loud, pained yelps echoed through the hall with increasing frequency. Several of the rank-and-file wolf humanoids crumpled to the rusted floor, twitching in agony before falling still. Their bodies remained where they fell. Dragging the fallen away under such intense fire was impossible. The pack began to waver, their attacks becoming less coordinated, tinged with panic. Hargrove recognized the turning point. Fire on the Alpha. Concentrate fire on the leader. His command crackled clearly in the operators' headsets. Several shooters occupying the most advantageous positions shifted their fire to the large figure of the pack leader. The Alpha found himself under focused, accurate fire. He moved with incredible speed, using every piece of cover, every dark corner to evade the incoming rounds. But bullets found their mark. One struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Another grazed his side, leaving a dark, bloody streak on the gray fur. His movements became noticeably slower, heavier. He was wounded, perhaps seriously. Seeing his pack suffering heavy losses and facing the threat of complete annihilation, the heavily wounded Alpha made a desperate decision. He let out a piercing, prolonged howl, not a battle cry, but a clear command. And the pack obeyed. The remaining wolf humanoids ceased their attacks and began a hasty retreat towards the far end of the hall, where there was apparently a known escape route. Perhaps a breach in the wall or an old service tunnel hidden in the shadows. The Alpha himself, gathering his last reserves of strength, did the unexpected. He turned and launched a suicidal charge at the nearest group of operators, drawing all their fire upon himself, buying his pack precious seconds to escape. Distracted by the Alpha's sudden, ferocious attack, the operators inadvertently relaxed their control over the escape routes. The remnants of the pack seized the opportunity and vanished into the darkness. The Alpha himself, bleeding profusely, took several more hits during his desperate charge. The withering fire threw him back. into a corner of the hall, near the base of a huge rusted winch. He collapsed heavily to the floor, unable to rise. His breathing was ragged, harsh, his massive body shuddering. The fight was over, but from his eyes, glaring up at the operators now surrounding him, the unbroken, primal fury had not vanished. Hargrove approached, his carbine aimed squarely at the downed creature. The threat was neutralized. All that remained was to finish the job. He raised his hand, ready to give the order to dispatch the wounded monster. The operators took aim. The silence in the vast hall seemed deafening after the cacophony of battle. Powerful beams from tactical lights converged on the downed figure of the Alpha, lying at the base of the rusted winch. The creature labored to breathe, blood spreading in dark patches on its gray fur and the filthy concrete floor. The operators held him at gunpoint, awaiting Captain Hargrove's command for the final kill shot. In that tense moment, Medic Grant, habitually scanning even a downed enemy for unusual details before confirming threat elimination, noticed something unnatural. Something glinted on the creature's neck, hidden beneath the thick fur matted with blood and grime. It wasn't the slick sheen of wet fur, but the reflection of light off metal. Grant raised a hand, signaling Hargrove. "Captain, hold fire!" His voice came, low but insistent, over the comms. Hargrove hesitated for a fraction of a second, lowering the hand he'd raised to give the command. "Hold your fire," he ordered the others. Exercising extreme caution, his sidearm ready, Grant slowly approached the still snarling but clearly weakened creature. He knelt beside its head, careful to avoid the gaze of its bloodshot eyes. Gently using a clean gauze pad from his kit, he wiped at the area on the Alpha's neck. Beneath the layer of filth, blood, and tangled fur, there was indeed metal. It was the remnants of some kind of device resembling a collar, deeply embedded, almost grown into the flesh and skin. On a miraculously preserved metal plate, engraved symbols were visible. Grant squinted, shining his flashlight directly on it. The words were clearly legible. Subject 01. Elias Vance. The realization hit everyone present with the force of a physical blow. This creature, this monster they had been about to execute, had once been human. It had a name. Elias Vance. Subject 01. The discovery sent shock waves through the team. A stunned silence hung heavy in the air for a heartbeat. The operators instinctively lowered their weapons slightly, looking from the inscription on the collar to their captain, then back to the creature, which now seemed less like a monster and more like a victim. And it was precisely in that moment, in that brief pause born of their astonishment, that the Alpha Elias Vance summoned an incredible final reserve of strength. He coiled his body and launched an unbelievable leap upward, his claws finding purchase on the rusted metal structures high overhead, near the hall ceiling. His movements were lightning fast, despite his grievous wounds. Before the team could react, process what they'd seen, and bring their weapons back to bear, Elias Vance had vanished into the dense shadows of the vast hall's upper levels. The sound of his labored breathing and the scrape of his claws on metal faded rapidly into the distance. "Pursue. Don't let him escape," Hargrove shouted, shaking off the momentary stupor. The team scrambled after him, climbing precarious metal ladders and running across creaking catwalks leading to the upper tiers. The pursuit was chaotic. The darkness, the complex, confusing structure of the hall, and the constant danger of collapsing walkways slowed their progress significantly. During the chase, while clearing one of the side rooms on the upper level, apparently a former storage area for spare parts or tools, the operators unexpectedly stumbled upon two bodies lying on the floor amidst the rusted junk. One man was clearly dead, showing no signs of life. The second was alive but unconscious and severely wounded. Neither was wearing Coast Guard uniforms or the ragged remnants associated with the creatures. They wore the tattered remains of lab coats over ordinary civilian clothes. Unmistakably, they were scientists from the Polar Star. Grant immediately broke off the pursuit and knelt beside the wounded man, beginning to administer first aid. Another operator examined the dead body. A moment later, a report came over the comms to Hargrove that made him definitively halt the chase. There were no claw or bite marks on the scientist bodies. The cause of death for one, and the severe injuries of the other, were gunshot wounds. Grant, quickly examining the entry points on the wounded man's clothing, made a preliminary caliber assessment. It was consistent with standard military issue ammunition used by U.S. armed forces. This discovery turned the entire picture of what had happened completely upside down. The scientists from the Polar Star hadn't been torn apart by the mutants they had possibly created. They had been shot. By whom? And why? Hargrove immediately issued an order over the radio. All teams, cease pursuit. RV at the storeroom, second level. We have a wounded survivor. Repeat, cease pursuit. The number of questions now vastly outnumbered the answers. The old storeroom on the second level of the Flensing Hall quickly transformed into an improvised medical station and a defensive strongpoint. While Medic Grant worked frantically to stabilize the condition of the severely wounded scientist, the rest of the team secured the area, taking up positions at the entrance and the few slit-like windows overlooking the main hall and an external catwalk. Sentries were posted. The tension didn't ease. The return of the creatures, or the appearance of whoever had shot the scientists, remained a distinct possibility. The beams of tactical lights cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted shelving units, tools coated in dust and frost, and Grant's focused face as he bent over the injured man. The quiet hiss of an oxygen mask could be heard, along with Grant's low commands to the operator assisting him. After what felt like an eternity, the wounded man regained consciousness. His first reaction was a surge of panic and terror. His eyes flew wide open. He tried to pull away, shielding himself with his arms despite the pain. "Don't shoot. Please don't kill me," he mumbled through cracked lips, his gaze darting wildly between the figures in camouflage surrounding him. Captain Hargrove knelt beside the makeshift bed fashioned from old canvas. He spoke quietly, calmly, trying not to frighten the scientist further. "Easy now. We're United States Coast Guard. We responded to your vessel's SOS signal. We're here to help. Try to relax. You're safe." He repeated the words several times until the scientist's gaze began to focus, becoming more lucid. Gradually, though still clearly in deep shock and suffering from the pain of his gunshot wound, he calmed somewhat. The trembling subsided. His breathing evened out. Gathering the remnants of his strength, the scientist began to speak. His voice was weak, halting. He identified himself as Dr. Alan Carter, one of the lead biochemists aboard the Polar Star. And then he told them the truth. A bitter, horrifying truth. The research vessel and its official mission, seismic monitoring and ecological studies, had been nothing but a cover story. The expedition's true purpose was a top-secret project codenamed Gene X. Deep within the Alaskan permafrost, in samples thousands of years old, a unique genetic marker had been discovered, possessing incredible regenerative properties. The project's ultimate goal was to create a universal cure capable of healing any wound, regenerating damaged tissues, essentially granting a second life. The initial research stages using animal models had been promising, even staggering. But when they attempted to stabilize the resulting agent for human application, unforeseen and catastrophic side effects emerged. The agent induced uncontrollable aggression and led to rapid, monstrous physical mutations in the test subjects. In desperation, pressured from above, Carter vaguely hinted at shadowy project curators from government or corporate entities demanding results at any cost. The project leadership took an extreme, illegal step. They began experiments on humans. The volunteers were prisoners from military stockades or individuals listed as missing, promised complete healing from diseases or early release. The result of these inhuman experiments was the creation of the very beings Hargrove's team had encountered. Elias Vance, a former Marine suffering from PTSD and severe combat injuries, had been the first test subject. Subject 01. And the most successful, if such a term could be applied. He retained a significant portion of his intellect and gained control over the other mutated individuals. According to Carter, shortly before the catastrophe, they had actually achieved a major breakthrough. They had managed not only to stabilize the mutagen formula, but also to synthesize a reversal agent, a compound capable of initiating the regenerative process in reverse, potentially restoring the subjects to their human form. It was a triumph of science. But it was precisely at this moment that the project's curators intervened. Carter mentioned a clandestine government agency and an associated military unit. They decided the technology had been obtained, further research was unnecessary, and all witnesses, both the scientists and the failed experiments in the form of the mutants, had to be eliminated. A heavily armed combat unit was secretly dispatched to the Polar Star with clear orders: exterminate everyone on board and scuttle the ship, leaving no trace. What followed was chaos and slaughter. The government unit began the purge, gunning down scientists in their labs and cabins. In a final desperate act of survival, or perhaps revenge, the remaining scientists managed to unlock the containment cells, releasing the subjects led by Elias Vance. A three-way battle erupted: the cleaner soldiers against the scientists and the escaped mutants. The mutants, driven by rage and pain, against anyone who bore a human appearance. The firefight on the ship's deck, the evidence of which Hargrove's team had seen, and the subsequent massacre at the whaling station, where the soldiers had attempted to hunt down the surviving scientists and escaped subjects. All of it was the result of the ruthless cleaners' actions and the bloody retaliatory response of the cornered, vengeful werewolves. The dying Dr. Carter's story hit the operators like a physical blow, a ton of ice. The staggering reality was brutal and ugly. They hadn't come here to rescue victims of a maritime disaster or hunt unknown monsters. They had become unwitting participants in the final act of a dirty, inhuman government operation to cover up a failed experiment. In fact, by hunting and killing the creatures at the whaling station, they had inadvertently been doing the cleaners' work, finishing off the victims. The image of Elias Vance, Subject 01, with the collar embedded in his neck, now took on a new tragic significance. He wasn't just a monster. He was a mutilated victim who had retained enough sanity to protect others like himself. Captain Hargrove and his men faced an insoluble moral dilemma. What were they supposed to do now? Report the truth? Relay Carter's testimony up the chain of command? Mention the collar with the name, the gunshot wounds on the scientists? That would mean going against the system, against the very shadowy government structures Carter had alluded to. It would almost certainly lead to unpredictable consequences for the entire team. They could be accused of leaking classified information, face a court-martial, or, more likely, simply disappear as inconvenient witnesses. They had no hard proof beyond the words of a dying man easily dismissed as delirium, and a metal collar that could be labeled a fabrication or a coincidental find. And what about the remaining creatures? Elias Vance and his pack? Leave them alive. They were wounded, disoriented after losing many of their kin and being driven from the whaling station. They were doomed to wander the icy Alaskan wilderness, posing a threat to anyone who might stumble upon them, while also being targets themselves. Sooner or later, other, better informed and more ruthless cleaners would hunt them down to finish the job. Their very existence was living proof of the secret project's failure, and such evidence is typically destroyed. Hargrove slowly rose to his feet. He looked down at the tormented, sweat-streaked face of Dr. Carter, who gazed up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He looked at his men. Their faces reflected confusion, horror, and a silent, burning question. He weighed the risks. Saving one scientist, attempting to bring the truth to light, meant jeopardizing his entire team, the 12 men who trusted him with their lives. He made the only decision he felt he could make in that moment. A decision that would protect his men from the fallout of someone else's dirty game. He stepped closer to Carter. The scientist tried to push himself up slightly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Hargrove silently raised his Sig Sauer P-229 sidearm and fired a single precise shot into the scientist's head. In the deafening silence that followed, broken only by the howl of the wind outside, Hargrove turned to face his men. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. We saw nothing. There are no survivors here, only tracks of unknown predators on the vessel and at the station. We're heading back to the cutter. Now. Dr. Carter's body remained where it lay, amidst the rusted junk in the old storeroom. The team departed the cursed whaling station in utter, oppressive silence. No one asked any questions. No one spoke a word on the trek back to the shore where the RIB awaited them. The weight of what they had done and what they had seen pressed down on each operator like an invisible burden. They silently boarded the inflatable boat and moved away from the ominous fjord, leaving behind the secrets and the dead. Upon returning to base, Captain Hargrove would file an official report. It would state, "Research vessel Polar Star discovered aground in fjord. Entire crew presumed deceased following an attack by unknown, extremely aggressive predators, believed to be anomalously large wolves or bears, tracks of which were found on the vessel and adjacent shore. Search for survivors yielded negative results. There would be no mention of Dr. Alan Carter, Project Gene X, the collar bearing Elias Vance's name, or the government cleaner unit. The operators of the Fjord Sentinels would return to their duties, carry on with their lives. But the memory of the bloody slaughter at the abandoned whaling station, the doomed gaze of Subject 01, and the final look of hope and terror in Dr. Carter's eyes would remain with them forever. An eternal, silent reminder that the real monsters sometimes wear human faces and government uniforms. The fate of Elias Vance and the remnants of his pack would remain unknown, lost somewhere in the vast, unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. End log.